Sounds good. Okay, well, thank you for having me here, Angel. This is super exciting. I love teaching this stuff. And so I'm just going to start with a little bit of my background, just so perhaps understand why I gravitated to this practice. Okay. So I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and soon moved to Italy, where I was just blessed by local food and attention to tradition and all these different things that I soon came to lack when I came back to the US. I wanted fresher food, I wanted it closer to me, and as it is, New Mexico exports more than 90% of the food we grow and imports more than 90% of the food we eat. So that is far away from ideal and frankly not very secure. So I started growing my own food more in depth after having kind of grown it passively in Italy. I put a lot of intention towards it. And about 3 years ago, I came across natural farming and essentially gave me the ability to expand what I was doing for a lot cheaper. Even organic inputs are still in bottles sometimes. And at the end of the day, it may have just been a consumer replacement for the synthetic market. We have been convinced that we need to buy a lot of things that end up being shipped from very far away where we have calcium here. And so without further ado, let's get on to just a little premise. I know I may be preaching to the choir here, but soil is alive and there's a nuanced interaction between the plants and the microbes. Let's just quickly touch on synthetic and that word, because even an organic nutrient can be synthesized to the point where it's only that. And so what does that mean? That means that when that gets put in a system that is complex like soil, that'll try to balance itself out. So a very highly synthetic nitrogen will start stripping all the carbon from the soil around it and ultimately discourage a lot of the microbial action, and it isn't teeming with microbes. Let's also talk about the Haber-Bosch. That's ultimately how they're taking nitrogen from the air and compressing it with hydrogen at a really high temperature and making this crystal form of nitrogen. We don't necessarily need to do that when our plants, when given the opportunity, can pull it out of the air themselves. So quickly, let's touch on the soil food web. If anything, this should show you that it is more complex than we think. It's not a pyramid. It's not easy. And if you take one thing away from this, is that fungi, they give phosphorus to plants and plants give carbohydrates back. If we give that plant synthetic phosphorus in the beginning of its life cycle, it will not want to create a relationship with fungi. Why give away some of its carbon? It just gets spoiled and doesn't create that long-lasting relationship where fungi actually help later in life and give a lot more support, both for water retention and, again, nutrient exchange. This is a graph by Matt Powers. He's a huge inspiration of mine. It's taught me a lot of what I know in this realm, and I just want to give him credit for that because it is a new graph, a new and improved soil food web graph, and I really like looking at it. Okay. Really quickly, let's touch on plant succession. I think this will just help later on. When we look at this may be a simplistic way of looking at it, and obviously there's more nuance, but conceptually from bacterial to fungal, that's going to be the more disturbed soils like your beaches, like your deserts, all the way to the old growth forest, which is more fungal. And it just so happens that the more disturbed, the more alkaline, and the more evolved, let's say, in the old growth forest, the more acidic. And where does this come in action? All of a sudden we realize we need to leave those plants that thrive in alkaline soil so that they can slowly help transform it into an acidic soil. So let's not go weeding everything. Let's let nature progress. Quickly, how that looks like from a pH point of view. That's alkaline, where all of the weeds thrive, and slowly it goes into acidic, where all of the fungi thrive. And if you think about it, fungi excrete enzymes and acids to digest the things around them. So it only makes sense that that's what the soil looks like. Okay, let's just first talk about avoiding dogma. There's a lot of different practices out there, biodynamic, there's all sorts of ways of doing this. And I'm here to tell you there's no specific way of doing it. And very likely everyone's going to have to do it based on their own bioregion and based on their own specific needs. So, if anything, we need more people mixing and matching all these practices so that we can evolve and find new cool ways to interact with them. So yes, let's go into this. I love Korean natural farming and JADAM, but I don't use all the inputs all the time. And when I do, you know, it's really kind of aimed at maximum, what makes sense for me, what's available around me. So here we go. What is KNF and what is JADAM? You know, very simply put, it's a list of recipes for plant nutrition, pest prevention, and microbial inoculation. But it's also a farmer sovereignty movement. At the end of the day, this gives a lot of reason for farmers to stop buying from external sources and producing their own nutrition, their own microbes. And what that leads to is more income for the farmer, and that farmer is able to expand and thrive more than ever. Now, let's look specifically. I'm just going to read this. Korean natural farming is an organic agricultural practice that emphasizes self-sufficiency by leveraging the power of indigenous microorganisms and the effectiveness of fermentation and acidification to bolster a stronger soil food web and make more bioavailable nutrients. Let's go to how it started. Now, there's a lot more to this. I'm going to be a little synthetic, but Cho Han-yu is the founder of KNF. This is really important to look into his background. He's a very passionate guy. This guy even has gotten beaten up for having organized people around this and was accused of ultimately organizing either an insurrection or a communist movement. So definitely worth looking into his past and what led him to Korean natural farming. But for now, what is important to know is that he studied in Japan, and what he bases a lot of KNF around are mainly fermentation history, enzymatic theory, and Japanese agricultural methods. Now, this should kind of like point to the fact that it is not only Korean natural farming. In fact, there's little remnants of even Vedic culture, a lot of Japanese farming methods, a lot of East Asia is wrapped up in this practice. And yet here in the US, we commonly refer to it as KNF, which is why I often find myself almost having to use that term to distinguish it, because natural farming is a bit too general. However, it has practices from everywhere. So just know that going into it. A lot of it is from Korea. Korea is known for a lot of these fermentation methods, but let's not be totally reductive there. Okay, so JADAM. JADAM is a series of ultra low-cost farming methods that are a combination of traditional natural farming principles and modern scientific innovations, all while avoiding ingredients commonly used in KNF, such as sugar, vinegar, and high-proof liquor that may be too expensive or inaccessible to some farmers. So Master Cho's son, Youngsun Cho, started JADAM, and his background and what really brought him to evolve on JADAM is the fact that he has a really big knowledge of chemistry, and he brought a lot of, let's say, way cheaper ways of achieving these different goals. For example, the soluble sulfur and the wetting agents, he's able to create these things without needing any external heat, because his chemistry background has allowed him to create certain combinations of elements that create heat internally. And so if you're off grid and you're needing to just be really cheap, you can solubilize your sulfur, which is otherwise really water repellent. You can solubilize it so you can spread it more effectively. And he open sourced that and ultimately could have made a lot of money by patenting it. So we have a lot of stuff that he has donated to the farming community, which is really nice. He brought natural farming to even cheaper level. He asked himself, what if you're way out in the middle of nowhere and you can't get vinegar, you can't get alcohol, you can't get sugar? And so that's what he did. We're going to get into the inputs here. But first, worth mentioning Masunobu Fukuoka. He is definitely part of this natural farming movement. However, there's a whole other presentation that's worth going into what he has done. I just wanted to mention him because within the realm, he has done a lot and very likely has influenced a lot of what goes on in the Korean natural farming. Why isn't it more known? Now, money is what I kind of came up with when writing this, because There's a lot of different reasons, but ultimately, why would you teach someone, in a capitalist model, how to make something that you could otherwise sell to them time and time again? And that means that there's no real big conglomerates marketing this thing. It's really spreading by word of mouth. And it's been interesting to witness, actually. It go from Korea, it slowly moved to Hawaii, from Hawaii to California. Obviously, with the internet, it has proliferated farther than that, but it really had to go from just really word of mouth. And people like Chris Trump in Hawaii and Drake then have helped popularize it for the US, but there's not a lot of people advertising this because it's not a good business model teaching people how to fish. So move on. Okay, now into the inputs. Indigenous microorganisms, that's your life. That's by far the most important thing that you'll be making in Korean natural farming. It is probably also the most time-consuming thing to be making. And what that is ultimately a fungal compost. I like equating it to the engine of the whole thing. This is not, most people use the life as this analogy, but if you don't have a big engine, there's no reason to have a lot of fuel. You can't just keep making these, sugar inputs and vinegar inputs and expect your biology to take it. If your biology is not revved up and ready to digest and ready to eat and ready to cycle these nutrients, then there's no point in you adding so much. So really focusing on your biology is what you want to do. So IMO 1, this starts with a collection box where you go out to an ideal undisturbed area and you let this partially cooked box of rice get inoculated by the surrounding microbes. Now, there's some nuance to this. This picture right here is Chris Trump with a collection box that's particularly fun in South America. I forget exactly where, but this cake of rice has been completely myceliated over. And what you're doing here is you're getting the life that you're going to put in your garden. And so by growing it on the rice and letting just the different spores and yeast and bacteria land on it, you're able to culture what's in that environment. He has it here in a cedar box because cedar is antimicrobial. We can get into the nuances of this. I don't want to go too far into each input, and I'll gladly address anything in the questions at the end. For now, what you really need to understand is that you're going to a really nice area, ideally no lower in altitude than you, maybe just a little higher in altitude, maybe an old growth forest, maybe somewhere where it's nice and healthy and vibrant, and you're putting these rice collection boxes out for a few days. Depending on the temperature, it's going to change. But what you need to know is that you're getting a lot of the life. And now a little footnote here is to say you're not getting the whole spectrum here. You're likely getting a majority of bacteria and yeast. Ideally, you would be getting some of the saprophytes, right? Some of those, some of the fungi that actually digest stuff and keeps those nutrient cycling. But we'll see how those actually come into the picture later. And so this is kind of a lot of people point this out in natural farming, that it's very likely that you're not collecting fungi in this, but it is the lower trophic layer. And so if you have all the food for the bottom, it's going to feed all the different layers that come above it. Okay, IMO 2. Once your box of rice is myceliated over, you can get it and stabilize it by putting it 1-to-1 with sugar. Now, this keeps for a while. Ideally, you'll use it as soon as possible, ideally within maybe 6 months. Maybe that's a little pushing it. Even though we know some microbes can stay in stasis for a very long time. A lot of crystallized microbes have even been found for a couple thousand years, just stay in cyst form and then can come back out. So this is a cool way to kind of put this on your shelf and have this life in stasis just for when you're ready to use it. So IMO 3, what you're doing here is you're expanding the life that you have just got from the forest. And you do this by adding that 1-to-1 sugar and IMO 1 to a pile that's carbohydrate rich, and that can be wood chips, but I've also seen recipes with dog food, and people have gotten really, crazy with this. But there's a lot that goes into it, including some of the inputs that I'll talk about later, such as the vinegar, the humic acids, and ocean water. However, the most important thing here to learn. If there's one thing that you like get from this, is that here we're making a fungal compost. And what that means is that it's not going to be a hot compost. A hot compost usually pushes 145, 155 degrees. And what that does is that kills all the fungi in there. And now maybe you have like a lot of weeds with seeds that you don't want to proliferate. And maybe you have some like, there's reasons to do a hot compost. But if you keep your compost under 120 degrees, you're allowing all the fungi to proliferate and myceliate. And here we have a fungal compost. And this is the thing that blew my mind probably the most. It's the beautiful way of keeping the fungi intertwined, and they're really the nutrient cyclers. So let's keep them around. Okay, IMO4. Here's when you take your IMO3 and you mix it with the soil from your garden. And what happens here is a lot of the life that may have been just kind of like slow and just ready to proliferate in your garden is now mixed with this really vibrant soil, and it's almost brought to life. And where you didn't have maybe those saprophytes, those fungi earlier, they come into play here, and they help essentially digest and pre-digest all this soil, and it makes an incredible inoculant for your garden. And you'll see, I don't know how clear it is on the image, but there's this mound, and the mound is myceliated. And some people even see mushroom fruiting bodies, and it's kind of a cool process. But as you can probably tell, it takes a little bit of time, it takes a little bit of effort. Okay, IMO5, quick touch on IMO5 is ultimately just using that IMO4, the nitrogen-rich fertilizer, helping it pre-digest it and deliver it to your plants. Again, none of these piles that you mix and turn do you want it to exceed 120 degrees. Let's keep our fungi around. Now, liquid IMO. This is really cool. What you can do is inoculate your garden by ultimately making a tea out of this IMO4. Ideally, you would also be spreading that IMO4 around your garden, but this kind of led to some cool discoveries. This is Chris Trump here in the image, and he tells a story of making an IMO pile, and he realizes that there were some bugs that were in that IMO pile, and they got myceliated over. And what ultimately that was telling him is that you could train one of these compost piles to actually hunt chitin bodies, or at the very least insects. And it's a really cool thing that people have been experimenting with, including Steve Reisner, Potent Ponics. He's in Thailand now, and he's doing these collections where he's cooking insects and rice, collecting it in the field, and then using that as a spray. And that actually starts attacking some of the insects. So imagine tailoring your compost to what you want it to fight. I think that is pretty cool. Okay, so let's go to the inputs. These are not all of them. You'll notice there are a lot of acronyms. That's because natural farming can get a little bit of a mouthful if you start saying everything, but I will try to say it all out. And so here we go. So lab. Lactic acid bacteria. This is a really cool input that you can make at home really easily just by essentially using the rice wash. When you rinse your rice, you get that water. You can leave that out about 3 days, 3 to 4 days, depending on temperature. You can smell it. It gets a little floral, a little yeasty. You actually get that and put it 1 to 10 with milk. And what will happen is you're inoculating this lactic acid bacteria, and it's creating that acid. It's curdling the milk, and it's creating milk curds and whey. And it just so happens that the whey is a super, 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 super powerful probiotic. It's also a facultative anaerobe. So whereas we really kind of demonize anaerobic environments, usually they're the smelly parts, there's some bacteria that actually thrive there. And why not team with the positive bacteria that thrives in those anaerobic situations? Because our soil is not anaerobic or aerobic. It's a combination of both. It's this flux. And so I use lab for a lot of different things. I actually sometimes put it in with my clothes, and I wash my clothes with it, and it prevents them from stinking if they stay there too long. People are doing pig farms that don't smell by creating a very deep mulch and perpetually spraying this lab, and that digests a lot of the nitrates and turns those nitrates into amino acids. And if you know nitrates, a lot of the time nitrates are the things that smell. And so lab is super cool. It is not the whole gamut of bacteria and microbes and fungi that you need is just one worker, but it does a lot of cool things. And I love making cheese with it too. You can take some very cheap, potentially, sterile milk and make it into a probiotic cheese. And that's just, the remnants of something. So that's another thing I love about natural farming is that the byproducts of the inputs you're making can be eaten and used. I add 2% salt to the curds and let it sit, let it drain a bit, and it makes a really nice cheese. You mix it with herbs. It's beautiful. Okay, anaerobic is not inherently bad because at the end of the day, even our gut has little anaerobic spots. So if you have, let's say, a more gunky area, you can start drinking some of these probiotics and the facultative anaerobes will be the ones that'll help you out of those gunky situations. I'm sure there's a more technical way of saying that, but I hope you understand. Okay, fermented plant juice. This is one of the main inputs, if we're kind of equating, let's say, to synthetic nutrients or even organic nutrients. This is your vegetative stage. What you're doing is you're getting green leaf matter or plant material, and you're fermenting it 1-to-1 with sugar. And what this does is that it extracts a lot of what that plant has inside of it, and you can then get that and feed it 1-to-1,000 to your plants. And just if you think of that conceptually, what better to feed a plant than another plant that has already gone through the effort of making itself? And so you can get some pretty interesting full spectrum-ish nutrients by using these whole plants. And there's actually databases that you can look at that point out what plants have what components. So you can be targeting things such as stinging nettle has a lot of silica and is generally a great plant for this. And so people like putting it 1-to-1 with sugar, getting that nice juicy extract, and then feeding it back to your plants. Now, because it's very sugary, you want to be careful, which is why this is at such a low dose. It's a very low dose. In fact, it's at 1-to-1,000. And it's more of a slight stimuli. The plants are already speaking with their own exudates. This is almost like putting another exudate in the mix. And because you're fermenting it, it's actually keeping some of that bacteria in there. And that gets me started on a whole like understanding endophytes, and they're actually, bacteria that live within the plant. And you might either be injecting the plants with the bacteria present in your ferment, or it may be causing an immunological response, and the plants may be actually revving up their immune system because of this. And now we're still looking into this. I think natural farming has a lot of experiments that can be laid out, and I'm kind of excited to proliferate it so more people can get on it and experiment. Now, fermented plant juice, that's for the vegetative stage. We have, let's just go to what plant is ideal for fermenting, because this is a very commonly asked question. Ideally, it would be biodynamic accumulators, be plants that grow really vigorously, non-toxic plants ideally, because I happen to even like eating my inputs too, and it's probably best that you don't put toxic material on your plants. So just plants that are known to be edible, known to be non-toxic. And then there's a whole other level of standard for this too. You want to be getting the growth tips of the plants, because that's where the most energy is. That's where it's all pushing its growth hormones and auxins. And you're also going to want to pick it in the early morning or at night, because that's when the plant is at its juiciest, or at the very least, it's not when it's like holding in all its juices from the sun in the day. In fact, this kind of translates to also when you're picking your herbs, you can actually get a more fragrant basil if you pick it in the morning. Now, the question here is, how many of these growth hormones and auxins are actually translating to the final product? I'm not totally sure of that. And I'm kind of hesitant to promise that, but I still know that that is probably the most ideal time and part of the plant to pick anyway, and will have the better nutrient components that one would hope for. So yeah, there's what parts of the plants are more ideal. Now, fermented fruit juice. This is similar to fermented plant juice, except you're using less sugar, because generally speaking, fruit have that sugar already. And so you want 1 part sugar, 2 part fruit. And this is your bloom formula. This is what allows your plants to go into the stage of your tomatoes flowering and then fruiting. You're going to want to feed it a fruit. If it's in veg,
Julian,
you're going to want to feed it.
Yes. Do you mind if we pause? Our microphone battery went out.
Yeah, no worries. Go for it.
So we're just going to try to find some.
It's HDMI'd into there.
Yeah, but it's just not working on my laptop. Like where the audio is not coming through because we have this adapter. I don't know if it just like. 1 second. I'm going to try one other thing.
No worries. I started this off with a technical difficulty, so.
Like maybe take one out of the remotes. Like take one out of the remotes. Yeah, usually it comes over our HDMI, but for some reason it's not. Sound isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying so otherwise, no, I have the forage, when you say forage, okay, maybe it's I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, let's try this.
Hey, test.
Okay,
Can you hear
we're
me?
back.
Sweet. Thank you. Okay. So let's see. To conclude, yeah, let's feed our plants vegetating plant matter when they're in their vegetative state and fruiting matter when they're fruiting. It's pretty straightforward. There's some nuance to this. Sometimes green fruit have the best ripening enzymes in them. But generally speaking, it's a cool rule of thumb to feed another plant that's in a similar stage. Okay. Brown rice vinegar. This is generally something that people use in KNF specifically because the rice vinegar has the ideal components in it. However, you can use any vinegar you'd like. In fact, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with extra biomass from your FPJs and your FFJs. Because once you extract those juices, all of a sudden you have these sugary plant matter that you can then plop in a jar, add some water, and vinegar will naturally start. You can add a vinegar mother to get it going, but there's a lot of cool things that you can do with the byproducts of natural farming. But either way, vinegar helps with chelation of nutrients. Usually add it a little bit into your inputs so that it can help, right, pre-digest some of those things, right? The acidity in the vinegar. Okay. OHN, Oriental Herbal Nutrient. Now, this is also known in Chinese medicine, but ultimately what it is an immune booster for your plants. It's using a lot of other plants that are otherwise antipathogenic and help with immunity, such as garlic, ginger, licorice, cinnamon, and angelica root. And you're tincturing them over the period of a month. And what you're getting is this concentrated antipathogenic immune boosting serum. Now, what it isn't is it's not a pesticide. It has to be given slowly. And for it to work, it has to just be slowly integrated into the plant. It's not something you just whip out when there's a problem. It's something that has to be slowly put in with all the different feedings that you give your plants. Can't really rely on it as a pesticide. But it is also very good. And I like drinking it myself. And it's kind of a cool little thing that you can make that's also good, especially now that we're going into winter and flu season's around the corner. Okay. Fish amino acids. This is probably one of the most fun inputs to make. And one of the inputs that has the most almost visible effect on your plants. This is made with fish parts, 1-to-1 with sugar, and you age them for a minimum of 3 months. The longer, the better. Now, what this is that it's creates amino acids. And what that is, it's just a super available form of nitrogen for your plants. And I've actually sprayed it on my plants and given them too much and seen too much growth. And I've gotten that kind of lanky water growth that happens when you give too much nitrogen. And it was kind of cool to just kind of push the limits on the dosage to see what would happen. And in fact, in natural farming, a lot of people call this the fuel. You can add too much. It can really throw things out of whack if you add too much, but it is really interesting to make. It's kind of simple. All you have to do is chop up some fish parts and mix them with the sugar and let them sit. I let my butcher sometimes just chop them up, and I like getting the heads because they're cheaper, and the heads actually have a lot more of those fats and lipids that ultimately are good for the ferment. So if there's, you know, one input that's kind of simple to make and it's really powerful, this one is like this one's a fun one. And the oilier the fish, the better. That's another comment. There's specific types of fish that are the best, but it's good to know that the oilier the better. In fact, this can almost be used as a pesticide when it has a really high oil content. It can help deter mites, even some types of aphids. So yeah, really powerful input. Okay, water-soluble calcium phosphate. This is really fun because ultimately what you do is that you get bones, you char them so that you're burning off all the organic matter, and then you're putting it in vinegar. And what that does is that it solubilizes the calcium phosphate in those bones and puts it in the vinegar. And now you have a shelf-stable calcium phosphate that you can give to your plants and encourage them to start fruiting. I like getting my bones when I'm out foraging. It means that the bones have already been kind of cooked down by the sun, and I don't have to like do any of the cooking off of the meat myself necessarily. I usually just make stock with those bones and go on with that. But it's a really easy way to capitalize on some cheap product to make something that really helps you in the garden. Similar to this is water-soluble calcium. In this case, looks like my picture didn't load. In this case, you make it with eggs instead of bones. And you go through the same process of charring them so that you're getting rid of a lot of the organic matter, so that once it's in the vinegar, that organic matter doesn't cause any spoilage in the future. So really cool way to add calcium. If you know, when it's really hot, plants have a really hard time moving calcium within them. And so just by having a foliar feed, right? So when you're spraying it directly into the leaves, ideally in the earlier part of the day when the stomata are more open, you can actually mainline calcium into your plants. It's pretty cool. Okay, diluted seawater. This is something that must be mentioned because it's really, really powerful. The sea ultimately has a really wide variety of minerals and elements. If not almost everything, right? Everything washes into the ocean eventually. And by reintegrating that in your garden, it helps you remineralize and maybe account for some of those trace minerals that might be missing. And so there's a way of doing this just by using salt. If you're not near the ocean, and if you are near the ocean at this point, you know, it's hard to tell what is polluted and what isn't. So what I personally do is I use C90. It's from the Sea of Cortez, super high mineral salt, and it's been tested for purity, and it has 90 minerals in it, which is really a lot, and kind of helps, again, take care of some of those micronutrients, right? If there isn't a little bit, you know, if there's a little bit of arsenic, it's hard for nitrogen fixation to happen.
Okay, sorry, Julian, we had it cut out again.
Sounds good.
Apologies. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. We don't always know what technical snafus we're going to run into. The resources we have here. Yeah, we'll try to. I have. We're going to try using a different microphone. which is actually going to be better for our Q&A. So let me just switch it on Zoom real quick. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, can you? Yeah, let's see. All right, can you speak up now and just say, keep talking?
Yeah, test 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
I don't really know where that.
Test.
Oh, there we go. It's like mic 1. Do we have to switch that one to
Can you hear me? So I can't hear you now. Can you hear me?
All right. Continue.
Perfect. Okay, that was a brief overview of the inputs. I apologize how quickly we went through them. There are lots. In fact, there are some that aren't on here. But for the time being, I think it's a good way to show, the whole pantheon that you can start making on your own. And there might be just one that called to you. I mean, you might want to start making cheese. And so you could look up the lab recipe. Okay, let's go to the JADAM inputs. So as before, one of the more important inputs is going to be the life. So in this case, it's JADAM microbial solution. JADAM microbial solution, this is what you're going to be doing in JADAM. It's not going to have the same biodiversity that KNF has, but it's a lot quicker. It's a lot more direct. And there are actually some people that only use this as a stimulant. And so what you're doing is for a 5-gallon bucket, for example, you're taking a handful of leaf mold, a nice big potato. You're going to cook that potato till it can release all its starches into the bucket. You're adding 15% salt. That salt is going to help deter pests and the pathogens that could create in there. And after a few days, that's going to bubble up. Now, this is very different from a lot of the compost teas that are happening. And a lot of people argue that this is a more stable way of culturing your bacteria, because in a lot of the aerated teas, that's going really fast. In fact, that's oxygenating the water at a higher level of oxygen that the soil even is. So this is a way to let the bacteria slowly consume the oxygen in the water, slowly consume the starches, and multiply. And what you're getting is a lot of this lower trophic layer, a lot of these yeasts and bacteria that then you're going to input into your soil. Everything above it is going to have a feast. It's going to grow and so forth up until your plant. So this is a very inexpensive way and really quick way of injecting bacteria and microbes into your soil. And I highly suggest doing this because you'll actually see some results. I see a lot of my plants perk up the next day. So definitely use that. Okay, JADAM liquid fertilizer, JLF. This is what would be your veg input when your plants are vegetating. Much like in KNF, you're using plants that are vegetating and you're fermenting them to give to your other plants that are vegetating. And in this case, you're ultimately letting it rot. And this is where it gets a little stinkier. Let's say Korean natural farming usually keeps things very stable, even at the level of human consumption. If you do things right, you can almost eat every single input you make in Korean natural farming. Whereas in JADAM, it's a little different, right? So what you're doing in this case is that you're taking some organic matter. Say you have tomatoes from one season and they're dying off. You take that, you put it in a bucket of water, you add some leaf mold. That leaf mold is going to help it digest all the different nutrients in there. And then I add a little pinch of salt. It's not necessary, but I like putting it in there just for stability. And what that does is that over the period of a few months, ideally maybe more than 2 or 3 months, that's going to digest all that. And what you're going to have is this sludge, this very reduced nutrient, which then you can feed to your tomatoes next season, and you're going to be giving them a lot of the nutrients they need because it was present in the tomato to begin with. Now, a lot of people suggest keeping your ferments, of one plant for the exact same plant. You don't always have to do this, but it does help, and it does make sense that a plant is its best fertilizer. Okay, so Jadam sulfur. I referenced this earlier as one of the recipes that Young Sung Cho put together. This is a really effective pesticide. Sulfur is an organic pesticide too. And what you're doing is you're making it soluble so that then you can spray it, and you don't need to use as much as if you just still had it in powder form. By making it soluble, you can actually spread it more effectively, and you don't need to concentrate it as much because, again, anything in high enough concentration will hurt. So this is really cool. Plants also need sulfur to a certain extent. It is a micronutrient that they need. So you're not only maybe giving your garden a nice spray in the beginning of the season to get rid of fungal pathogens too. A lot of blights are solved by this, but you're also giving your plant that micronutrient that it may need later on. Okay, Jadam herbal solution. This makes so much sense it hurts. It's kind of interesting that you can take a lot of these plants that have their own endowed pest resistance and use it against the pest that you're trying to target. Now, I have a book that comes with the Jadam. It's called 100 Herbs. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll show it off later. And ultimately, it goes through a list of all the different plants and what they're good at targeting. And so you may have a lot of rosemary around. What you do is you make a tea, and a concentrated tea, and that scent alone can help deter things. Now, it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it is pretty effective. And I have used it for aphids, and I've seen a good result. Sunchokes are commonly used. Ginkgo leaf is commonly used, but you can also, use really spicy peppers. Maybe you're trying to deter gophers and you want to spray spiciness all over the place. Just make a tea out of that, out of those peppers, and then hopefully that'll at least help deter some of the rodents. Okay, now, Jadam wetting agent. What this is ultimately is a Castile soap. But again, he makes it so that you can actually produce it without needing any external heat. And so you combine these elements. I forget off the top of my head which one it is exactly. I'll probably reference that later on, but it's bringing your fat, some kind of oil, to a really high heat, and ultimately saponifying it into a soap. And it kind of gets really hot. You have to wear protection goggles. So does a sulfur, so this isn't something you're just casually doing in your kitchen. But it is a cool way to make your own soap. And so in the garden, what this does is that it creates, it breaks the surface tension of the water. So when you're trying to spray something, instead of the droplets, getting all, separated, it spreads it out more effectively, and you're able to cover a lot of these insects, and you're avoiding a lot of the issues that come with just spraying without a wetting agent. And then I also use it at home. I use it to shower. I use it for my laundry. It's a very effective soap. And once you've made it yourself, you realize how cheap soap can be, and it's hard to buy other soap again unless it's for a specific specialty reason like conditioner or whatnot. So yeah, that's a cool input that again goes beyond just the garden and can help you in the home. Okay, that was Jadam. Now I'm kind of like capping this off with some resources. I've only been doing this for 3 years. There's a lot of people that have been doing it for longer. And so I definitely suggest everyone writing these down and looking them up later, because first of all, Chris Trump, he has brought this to Hawaii, and he has done it at scale. He has a macadamia farm that's pushing 500 acres, and he showed that you can actually scale this up to where it works. It's not something that is, relegated to the kitchen or to the hobbyist. It's something that you can actually apply. In fact, it's kind of interesting to witness the California cannabis market tank, and all of a sudden people were forced to start using a lot of these natural inputs because they were cheaper, because all of a sudden their cash crop wasn't worth nearly as much as before. And so it almost force functioned some of natural farming. And I believe Chris Trump helped make that translation to the mainland. Drake, he is part of the Pure KNF Foundation. He has a ton of YouTube videos, as does Chris Trump, and he does live on YouTube every Sunday answering questions. I believe he's still doing it, but it's nice to just hop on occasion if you have something you're wondering. He's pretty useful. Obviously, do your research before asking him. He gets a lot of trivial questions, and it's likely available already, but yeah. He also made the Pure KNF app, which is a really cool app that you can have on your phone, and it helps you scale everything pretty directly. It's like, how many gallons of water am I feeding? You put that in and it shows you how much of each input you need. Okay, on YouTube, obviously there's Chris Trump and Drake at the Pure KNF Foundation, but even Jadam Organic Farm and Garden, Young Sung Cho, his organization, they put a lot on YouTube. That's very extensive and has a lot of detail. Nature's Always Right does a great job. John KNF, also Bear Mountain Farm. These are all people I've learned from throughout the years. And, you know, it's always good to get different perspectives, and all of a sudden someone's applying something a little different, and it's kind of cool to see what's going on. On Facebook, there's a KNF and Jadam group, pretty straightforward to find. There's also an Outside the KNF box, which is a really fun group where people are experimenting. And, you know, there's some pretty hardcore KNFers out there that are KNF or die. And there's some cool things that you can do outside of it. So it's cool to see what's done outside of that realm. You know, personally, I'm using now Koji, which is this filamentous mold that makes a specific set of enzymes, that I'm using that to pre-digest proteins into amino acids for my plants. I think there's a lot of different things we can do. Okay, on Instagram, Marco is growing, does a lot of great natural farming stuff. Bluegrass Green Thumb, KNF Garden. I mean, KNF Garden blew my mind at a certain point where he's doing ferments with the roots of the plants so that he is re-inoculating at least some of the biology back in. Nature's Always Right again. And of course, my page, Ecological Projects. I try to stay pretty active there and give educational information on mushrooms, natural farming, and the whole gamut. And then there's some cool academic research to look into. The University of Hawaii has published some papers. You know, some arguably from a Korean natural farming perspective weren't done ideally, but a lot of them yielded some cool results. And ultimately, it's hard to get research done on something that isn't patentable. Obviously, there's going to be people who do it, but something like lab, which you can make very inexpensively, why would a research facility study its benefits if they can't justify the cost of it then paying for itself? So it's good that these guys are doing research. It's nice that the word is spreading so that more people can, you know, show their universities that there may be some really cool things to discover. Yeah, and that's about it. So I'm eager to hear some of your questions, and I really appreciate everyone for listening in, and I hope you are going to take something actionable from this presentation. And of course, you can always reach out to me afterwards as well.
All right. Thanks so much. That was great. Okay, so folks out on YouTube and on the Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the chat as well. But here tonight at Zilker Botanical Garden, does anybody have some questions about any of the inputs or just general questions? It was a very thorough, a lot of good breakdown of all the different inputs and recipes. And I know there were a lot of them, so we record all of these videos, and you can always refer back to it on our YouTube channel. So just remember that as well. So yeah, Marty.
So does it matter what sugar you use? I mean, just regular cane sugar,
Yeah, so she's asking, does it matter what kind of sugar, like cane sugar or?
Yeah. So in an ideal world, it will be
Uh,
organic cane sugar. Because first of all, if it's not organic, likely, as you all know, it might have pesticide remnants, which discourage the fermentation you're wanting to achieve. And also what's probably most important is that it's actually crystalline. You do not want to be using a molasses, because what's happening is the crystalline nature, remember what we said about synthetic, right? That crystalline nature almost sucks that juice out in with osmotic pressure. And so it actually gets you where you're going, instead of using maybe some of the more refined bleached sugars that may not yield as well. So organic cane sugar, because you're going for that crystalline nature. So no molasses. That's something people sometimes go for, but yeah, organic cane sugar.
Okay, any other questions? Yes. Yeah, the same question about vinegar.
So for vinegar, you want it to be organic. Rice vinegar is what's used because of the specific palate it has. It does do things well, but you could use almost any vinegar. Now, I've made a pineapple vinegar that those particularly pungent, and that if you know pineapple, it carries a lot of protein digesting enzymes in it. And so that's one that I had to go a little lighter on. But you can make a lot of very simple vinegars. You can use your apple scraps, and let's say for a quart, I believe you can throw in your apple scraps and a quarter cup of sugar, and a natural vinegar process will start right there. And you can use that. Once it's acidified, you can use pH strips to make sure it's at an acidity of around 3 pH for maximum effectiveness. And if you want to do it really well, you can actually cap it off and put an airlock on it. It'll go into an alcoholic fermentation, and then the acidic acid bacteria will transform that ethanol into vinegar later, and you'll get a stronger vinegar if you first make alcohol. That's a little technical, but otherwise, just generally vinegars, you can use white vinegar, but white vinegar is a very processed thing, and ideally, even fruit vinegars are perfectly fine. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
If you don't live near the sea,
Yes.
can you use sea salt to dissolve in water?
Yeah,
You have to
so
get a different kind of-
that's a great question. So the question was, if you don't live by the sea, can you use sea salt?
Yes, you
make-
can. Yeah, you can absolutely use sea salt. I definitely recommend no iodized salt. There's just a lot of reason to use your fresher sea salts. I suggest using C90. That's something you kind of need to order. But otherwise, just a nice, whatever looks kind of clean, but a sea salt will deliver some of the same effects. And salt is kind of good to have in the system anyway. A lot of these synthetic nutrients have demonized salt because that's what they use as their transferring agent a lot of the time. And so it's good. It's good for the electrical conductivity of the soil. And so I would say, yeah, sea salt, the more, natural, the better. Obviously, if it's it needs to be clean as well. But yeah, any sea salt will work for that. Yeah, is a simple answer.
Okay, in the back.
Wow, I
That's a good question. So the question was, can you use lab to help with the kind of breaking down of rabbit droppings and then be able to control the odor? Did I repeat it back? The urine.
Yeah, totally. In fact, it's ideal for urine because the urine creates a lot of those nitrates, which can be transformed into amino acids. So yeah, even putting a little bit of lab in a spray bottle. Again, you can put that 1 to 1,000. So even just a little dropper in a spray bottle should at least help take the odor down. Now, what a lot of people do in their pig pens is that they have a deep mulch system where, I'll take a drink,
Mhm.
deep mulch system that actually retains a lot of the probiotics. So if your bunny's in a cage with kind of like an open floor, like kind of, or plastic, it's kind of harder to maintain that smell reduction. So obviously most animals have bedding, and that bedding will help retain that lab. So yeah, I'd absolutely use it for that. It's done marvels for even certain areas. My dogs, for example, pee in the backyard, and when it rains, unfortunately, you can almost smell the ammonia, and I like just spraying it down. A lot of people actually use lab right after a rain, because rain is not always clean, and it might bring things in, and it's almost like a good reset. But you can use lab too much, and it kind of makes me think a lot of one example, a lot of people use milk as like powdery mildew prevention. That's ultimately attracting lactic acid bacteria. And so this is a way to just get right to the chase with that. And so any animal manure, it'll really help, especially if it comes along with the bedding, that can help retain that as well.
Yeah, any other questions? I'll look on the Zoom chat and the YouTube as well. Any questions out there?
One more. You mentioned red plates and stuff.
Yes. Yeah, so our soils, we do have some clay soils out here, but I don't think that we have this. You probably have a lot more red clay where you are.
Yes.
We don't have it, or do you think there might be an alternative type of place or sulfur-ish natural resource that we have here in Texas?
So in that sulfur recipe, the clay is actually a separate component. It's not delivering the sulfur itself. It's actually what's going to help coat everything even more and spread that sulfur. It's not an essential component. And what I end up getting is the rarefied, like 99.99% sulfur online. It's kind of risky. I've thought of using, natural springs, sulfur water, but you don't know what's coming out of there unless you're getting that tested, which then also costs money. Then I would go with the tested purified sulfur for that. And you can use, a lot of rivers will have clay somewhere along the shore, so you can kind of like explore and see if there's any clay you can extract from there. Obviously responsibly, but it doesn't have to be red clay. It can be any type of clay that when made into a powder, it helps, again, spread that sulfur. So yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I think we'll see everybody down by the Colorado River digging up their clay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or lower Colorado. We have a different one here. A lot of people confuse it with the Colorado River. Questions? Let's see. So I'm looking at the Zoom, and someone asked, someone missed the first part, and they were just curious if you have a farm or garden in Albuquerque area that they could visit.
Yeah. So I have my little house. We just moved here, so I'm still evolving it.
We're getting a little internet.
Oh, I'll pause then. Okay. So I have my little garden here in Rio Rancho.
Let's try that again.
How's that? Okay. Test.
Yep.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So I have my little garden here in Rio Rancho where, frankly, my soil, we just got here last year, and my soil is still evolving, and I'm growing in containers and doing a lot of my natural practices in those containers as I start to remediate the soil. And so I don't know how many pesticides are in my soil, so I'm drenching it with lab. I'm inoculating all the bacteria. I've grown out my IMO so I can slowly water that in. and make sure that that's safe. And then I have my grandmother's house where I've been working on essentially a wood chip food forest, which I maintain, and is starting to get fruit trees, and we have some raised beds that it's kind of my experiment ground too. Sometimes I feed one bed a lot and let the other one kind of die back. And so, yeah, if you're in the Albuquerque area, definitely hit me up. I'd love to do even some in-person classes too, and look at some plants.
Great. All right. Like what you're talking about with the fruit vinegar.
Can you repeat that question? It cut out at the beginning.
Yeah, so someone was asking if like Bragg's, like apple cider vinegar is what you're kind of referring to when you're talking about you can use vinegar from fruit.
Totally. Yes, you can use your run-of-the-mill apple cider vinegar. That'll work great. You're still using small quantities of it. I guess we're talking more idealistically when I talk about rice vinegar, but yeah, the store-bought vinegar will be fine. But a lot of the whole point of this is to make it yourself too. I feel like that's a lot of the foundation. And hopefully what KNF shows you is that you can produce these things on your own quite passively too. At the end of the day, vinegar is probably one of the easiest things to make with your fruit scraps. You add enough sugar and you just let it sit. I mean, you don't even need a mother if you don't want. And so you don't even need to make it food grade. Then you can use that to clean your house. You can use that for all sorts of different things. And so, yeah, you can totally use vinegars like the Bragg's. Yeah, but make your own if you can.
Yeah. So I have a question. I may have asked this when I first met you in New Mexico, but I like to make a lot of wines from KNF and Natural Farming. I made prickly pear wine, and I had like let it go through its like 2 weeks of fermentation. And then I, kind of did like the brew in a bag method where I had all the pulp from the prickly pears like in the bag. I was like, what if I like, take what's left, like the residual sugar, like add more sugar. Could I do that? Like, I think it was the IMO 3.
Or it might be, I think that would maybe be more applicable in JADAM, where you can use it in
Okay, yeah.
a JADAM microbial solution. So sometimes, instead of the potato, which is the ideal nutrient source, you can add another nutrient source like that prickly pear pulp. In fact, that might be steered more towards like a bloom formula, because what you're doing is you're putting that fruit in there, and what you're going to create are, likely phosphorus digesting bacteria or digesters that are used to digesting fruit, and they'll be able to digest what's in your soil that will lead to better fruit. And so, yeah, you can use that extra definitely as fodder for a vinegar, as fodder for the JADAM microbial solution. Yeah. And prickly pear is super antioxidant and definitely carries its own benefits as well. Yeah. In fact, I have mine right here. Some prickly pear wine using prickly pear, sugar, and then airlock. Sorry, that cut out again. Can you repeat that?
Yes. You spoke a little bit about like using the
Yeah, I cut out again. Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, I'll let you reset. And thank you for everyone that's tuning in as well. I Really hope you guys take something from this. Okay. Here you are. I still can't hear you, Angel. Okay. I can see you now. I believe you're on mute. For everyone who's on the live stream, and show you my cheese. See if that kind of getting blurred out, but this is a big batch of lab. These are the cheese curds from a past lab. I put a little barrier here at the bottom so all the whey can drain out of the rest of the curds. 2% salt. It's really good. This is a fish amino acid, but instead of fish, I use the deer I harvested a couple of years ago. And it hasn't made as nearly as much liquid as the fish, but it has fermented and it smells great, surprisingly, for shelf-stable meat. Some of the fish amino acids. Yeah, I think maybe you can see the fish head in there. Yeah. Some of the pineapple vinegar. Once you strain it, it can be pretty clarified. But again, this is really strong pineapple. A lot of those enzymes. And here's a kombucha. So what's going on here is that actually, instead of vinegars, sometimes I do kombuchas. My friend Josh mentioned that back in the day that kombucha is actually acidified to the same point. There's a lot of vinegars at the end. So I also use kombuchas to extract my soluble calcium in. Then you can start stacking things. And what if all of a sudden you're using a very rich vinegar to extract your soluble calcium in? You have not only soluble calcium, but it comes along with more nutrients, maybe some more probiotics. Just waiting for Angel to come back on and let me know what to do. But for now, I'll show you one of the other tools that I really like is a spectrometer. Spectrometer, really inexpensive tool, can help you decide what and see what the Brix is of your liquid. So if you're trying to make a vinegar, or if you're trying to make some kind of wine, and you get a certain yeast that reacts well to a certain amount of Brix, then you know how much sugar to use, and you can actually use the FPJ, the fermented plant juice sugar, as fodder for fermentation. And you add it to the liquid, and you get a little dropper, you put it on the end, close it up, shoot for the stars, and depending on how blue it is, it will tell you approximately the Brix that it's at. Let me make sure Angel isn't texting me. Okay. Yeah, that's ultimately very inexpensive tool. I think $18 will get you this, and it's a pretty cool contraption if you're wanting to be more precise with your ferments. But other than that, a lot of Korean natural farming and JADAM is based on ratios too. So it keeps out of so much of that numbers game. Like lab, you're adding 1 part of this rice water yeast inoculant, bacterial inoculant to